The format this morning, this is a lecture, but I'm going to distribute, hopefully in 5 minutes, we'll get copies of the slides. The slides were prepared by our colleague Roger Leeds, who's another SAIS professor and the co-founder of LAD. And Roger and I are doing an exchange this month. So I'm doing his lecture on finance, and he's doing my lecture on PPP. I'm doing this lecture in Tbilisi. He's doing my lecture in Bangkok, Thailand. So it's very international. And we've prepared both slides from a format point of view. Now, just as a way of introducing this subject, a viable and strong financial sector is essential for any long-term growth. It's not just the integrity of the system, but it's the functioning of the system. And if I was emphasizing something yesterday in PPP, it was that PPP skills and PPP learning give you a toolkit, not a template. Because so many PPPs are different, one from the next. Redoing the boulevard close by is a completely different idea than Central Park, but you have the tools and you can apply them. That's what we learned yesterday. But here we do need templates. In other words, a stock exchange should be a stock exchange. It should be, they should be similar in their fiduciary responsibilities. They should have certain characteristics. And we will go through the different institutions. So I want you to be thinking about translating PPP tools into a template, and then, in this case, learning more about the kinds of institutions. Then what we have to do is we have to think clearly about context. So Georgia is not New York. The New York Stock Exchange has a long history. It's changed over time. And here, the idea of an exchange is brand new. It doesn't exist yet. Well, it does exist, but it really doesn't function at a level that we can understand based on regular data and performance. If we were to look at last night's panel, and we were to add the economy as a priority as opposed to the political and international relations situation, we would really want to have a strategy to build up financial institutions. Financial sector development, we would need a strategy. And just the way we did yesterday with stakeholders, we would want to understand the sequence we need to do this. And we would want to understand the kinds of institutions that are involved and what their fiduciary responsibilities are, so that we feel protected when we're proceeding. So again, I apologize for the amount of volume of print on each slide. We've done our best to make it more readable. These questions I'll distribute in a minute, but a couple of things to highlight right now. We're going to be describing the components of a system. We're going to understand why they may be keywords different and maybe more difficult to regulate than other private sector activities. We want to have an understanding of what's the regulatory supervisory structure. What is a country comfortable with? We're going to make some assumptions here that corruption is not going to infiltrate the financial sector. That doesn't mean that that's true, but let's use it as an assumption so our minds can think more clearly. We want to understand how to link directly financial sector development to the pace of economic growth and other benefits, including helping people rise up from poverty or from working levels to middle class and beyond. What are the building blocks for the financial sector? And why are we doing this? Why is it so critical to do this, to achieve success in financial sector development? So I think this is very comprehensive, and it will take time. I want to make one qualitative comment. Every time someone tells me that the work they do is complicated, it's very strategic. These are policy issues. And if only you could understand, I'm immediately alert to the fact that this person can't explain what they're doing clearly enough. That they think that by describing something as complicated, that maybe it's above my level. So we're not going to do that today. We're going to assume that if you can't understand it, then I'm failing. Why is financial sector development and regulation harder than pharmaceutical development and regulation? One has to do with making an investment. Your consequence is you lose your money if it's not properly regulated. The other, the consequence is you lose your life. So we want to have a perspective about what institutions should be doing and what does it mean in terms of your personal security as a citizen of a country. So we're going to describe a system, then regulation, and then development. In terms of the system, these are interconnected components. It's a coincidence that it's the same shape up here. Yesterday we had public value. Here we have the institutions. They're supported by policy, and they're supported by markets. It's a really simple schematic. Policies and markets. Now, policies without markets, it's a non-functioning financial institution. Markets without policies, it's an ungovernable system. So that balance is important. Who are the players? So the private sector consists of the banks, mutual funds, intermediaries, including unregulated partnerships, many times called hedge funds. You have many requirements: securities laws, accounting, capital adequacy, foreign exchange management. These things are familiar in anything of a developing country. The public sector institutions, central banks, domestic regulators, and then in countries where outside support is essential, you have a form of regulation from the World Bank or the IMF, and these institutions can be very powerful, as we've seen in Europe in the last several years. The markets, you obviously have typically a separate market for stocks, equities, bonds, money, derivatives, foreign exchange, and different governing mechanisms over markets that are domestic versus international. How we interconnect these components is a challenge. Okay? In finance, I think it's very useful to look at statements that display clearly and understandably the sources and uses of funds. And in investment banking, it's critical to understand the sources of funds and the users of funds. Not just the uses, but the users. So a source would be savers. In Georgia, it's going to be impossible to build up adequate capital for investment to match foreign direct investment unless you have some organized method of savings. So the proposed pension system that is going to be put into effect at some point, that is a key way to help savers institutionally save and accumulate capital. Then the question is, how will this be managed? So it goes into financial intermediaries. There can be vehicles for savings, such as mutual funds, pension funds, insurance. You can go to the bank. There are many who want your money for the purpose of earning a fee as an intermediary for managing it. They, in turn, go to security markets to make markets to buy and sell and price the securities. Without honest pricing, regular, reliable pricing, you can't value the securities that are being held and managed for you. So the market function's critical to understanding where you are. Now, how about the users? If you want to borrow money, you're doing it as a household or a corporation, it doesn't matter. Governments borrow money all the time. Financial institutions lend money to each other. So these users then hopefully will put money back into circulation. So this should be a dynamic display of the performance of financial institutions. Sources and uses of funds in the financial system. Now, this is also interesting because when we talked about water the other day, we talked about supply and demand issues. So right now, we want to increase the supply of funds, capital on the savings side, and we want to increase that supply so that there can be demand that increases as well. Demand for capital that's going to be put to work in this country, matched probably by other parties, will allow for economic activity. If the demand is there but the supply is not there, it's hard to execute that demand. Just raise your hand at any time if you have questions. Yes?
Sorry for being late, first of all. If demand is, I'm sorry, but I have this logical question. If demand is there, then if you have really free markets, shouldn't supply appear?
Okay. So this is the kind of question, just before you arrived, I made the comment that anytime someone describes their area, oh, it's very complicated, it's very strategic, these are policies you may not understand, and we'll try our best. But that's not a good enough response. So if there's demand, you would think that the supply of capital would go to that demand. But when we looked at public-private partnerships yesterday as a subject, we talked about bankable projects. In other words, is a project suitable for investors? Does it meet criteria in terms of adequate cash flows that allow after for there to be a positive result? The net amount would be used to service debt. So if the users are saying that this is what I need money for, but investors and savers say your idea of using money is not a sound economical proposition, they're not going to put savings there. Now that should be true if I'm a citizen of Georgia or a citizen of England wanting to invest in Georgia. There are investors all over the world looking for markets that are going to grow at above average rates and that have sound institutions. Everything that was stated by Frank in the opening lecture is very important for sound financial markets. Value of contracts, all of these things. So let's say Georgia has these things. How does it attract money? Is it only because it has needs, or are those needs financially sound? Okay? What are some of the functions? Now we're using the word key functions here. Doesn't mean that it's comprehensive, but it's a long list. We definitely want to motivate people to save. We want to use investment products. We need a way to clear and settlement. There's the mechanics of the securities industry. If you're going to sell this to me, we did this with water the other day, $10, remember? Who could forget $10? You're going to sell this to me, but you're using an intermediary, so you're handing it to your intermediary, and then the intermediary hands it to me. There's a settlement process that this goes through. And that's where the security electronically is matched with cash and settled. Now, when I started in the securities business, it was not all electronic. There were many, many countries in the world, and I visited many of them after the stock market crash in 1987, that had paper systems, including Thailand and many in Europe. I went to Milan 9 times one year because we were trying to get them to improve their system. If securities do not clear and settle in a timely fashion, the system can get stuck. People don't know what their positions are, and you may not be able to get your money. So by selling this, Nano expects absolutely to get cash in return in her account within a well-defined period of time. And if she doesn't, maybe she's already used that cash to buy something else. So then that second transaction is held up. Price discovery. What is the price that the financial system tells you is reasonable? Right now, we really don't know, honestly, the price of many securities, because the pricing influences, interest rates, are being managed by central banks. Or there may not be enough liquidity, so the price right now, if I'm trying to sell something, will be lower than I think it's worth, or if I want to buy it, it could be higher. So price discovery is usually done by intermediaries. It's a very complex system, and it is one subject to manipulation. We want to see the system produce liquidity. If we want to sell this, we want to be able to sell it. We don't want to have to wait a month to sell it. That's why real estate can create a crisis, because selling real estate is time consuming. And whenever the type of investment that's subject to a sale or a purchase is unique, like a house is unique, that means there's a separate pricing process, and that takes time. Also, there can be separate documentation. How do you monitor financial performance? Without some system that tells you where you are and how you're doing, or if you're using a manager, a professional manager, how they are doing, it's extremely difficult to rationally be in markets and invest. So these things also require other considerations. What's your cost of transacting securities? Or going to the bank and using an ATM. So if I come here and I want to take out local currency, I'm going to be charged a transaction fee. At the airport, there's foreign exchange, a transaction fee. Why do most of us try not to exchange money at the airport? Because the transaction fees are very, very high as a percentage of the assets. That's how you measure transaction fees. If they're 1% or 2% or 5%, that's an incredibly high. How about 1/10 of 1%? The transaction fee directly cuts into your return. So if you want 100 euros and you're only getting 95, you've given up 5 euros for the transaction fee. Financial systems do not operate through finance textbooks alone. They operate under realistic circumstances. People make mistakes, computers make mistakes, or systems break down. We have seen recently, it's only been 7 or 8 years since the financial system in the United States and then later Europe virtually collapsed. A system that freezes up is a non-functioning system. If people withdraw all their bids to buy something, or they're terrified to sell because they don't know if they'll get an exchange for what they're selling in the form of currency and what the liquidity of that currency is, that means that the difference between theory and reality is pretty wide. The private sector does everything. Typically doesn't run a police force or a military, but as Frank mentioned, you can have your own private police force if you need to. But here, generally, a financial sector that's operating is very far-reaching. Everybody can have access to it if they have a means. Sometimes the poor do not participate in a financial sector, particularly in emerging markets. You can have a third of the population or more that doesn't have a bank account, doesn't have access to liquidity. They're using other ways. There's a rationale for subjecting these institutions to regulation and the users of the system to government protection. So this is where financial systems policy comes in. Should we protect the players? Or are they adult players and they're sufficiently sophisticated to know that they're at risk? Most political systems try to have some type of protection for investors, savers, and banks so that they don't lose their investment if the system fails. I'd say it's an objective, and the size of the objective can vary based on the size of the economy and policies toward regulation. It's unrealistic to expect that governments are fully capable of eliminating all risks and misbehavior. So you go in understanding that there are risks. There are risks from crises, from financial instability. Clearly, last night in the panel, the Night Owl session, there's all sorts of talk about Russia. It's amazing. I've heard more about Russia recently than I've heard in quite a while. And Russia's always in the news. But I don't have a Russian military 20 miles from here. So it's a vivid reminder that how about if there's a disruption of our system because someone takes it over? That's what's happened in the Middle East. ISIS has actually taken over banks, literally taken the money out, and put it under its own control. How are savers protected under those circumstances? They're not. They're just not. Regarding regulation, here we get into the different and then later the difficult, those two words. We want to be less vulnerable during crises. We want to have government protection, and we want to improve public welfare. How does the financial sector perform those objectives in mind? First, this is a really important word, custodian or fiduciary. The financial sector must have fiduciary responsibilities. If I'm a fiduciary of a bank, of savings, or of a mutual fund, literally in my contract it might use the words safekeeping. I am there to protect the assets held under my responsibility. The entire mutual fund industry depends on this, no matter where it's located. If the fiduciary is not adequate to protect the assets, then they need to be changed. You have to evaluate fiduciaries. Every country should have fiduciary institutions. Do you trust them? Is it possible for someone owning or running a fiduciary institution to go in past procedures and take money out? That's a crime. That's stealing. But is it possible? Because sometimes that money may disappear, and what can you do about it? So the reliance on the private sector, this is where we're different. Private sector, for the execution of government monetary policy and the custodial function, that means that the government is not performing this function. There's nothing wrong with the private sector doing this as long as the policies, protections, and penalties are clear. If you're dependent on leverage for profitability, that is inherently unstable. Well, what I mean by that is if I want to buy something for $1 million, one of the buildings on the thoroughfare, I have no idea what they cost, but let's say there's some building that costs $1 million to keep the math simple, and I only have $100,000 in cash to buy it. That means the balance of the purchase has to come in the form of a $900,000 loan. So I have $900,000 per $100,000 of investment, and that's a leveraged loan. But how about if I only put up $10,000 and the rest was borrowed? That would be 100 to 1, highly leveraged. Now, if the price of that building goes down from $1 million to 900,000, and I only have 10,000 involved, my equity is wiped out. I still owe the debt. So if I've borrowed, let's say the original 900,000, it goes down by $100,000. I don't have any value left, but I still owe the 900,000. Leverage is a concept that very smart people have been able to make highly unstable through derivative securities, mathematical formulas, and this means that there are characteristics where all of these interconnected potential failures in the system, that's what happened in 2008 and 9, can create a contagion that can spread from one institution to another. So government, can they protect us at taxpayer expense? In emergencies, usually they can. In the United States, the system actually worked well in terms of the regulators maybe not doing their job before, doing a job eventually. All right. Now we talk about, is this difficult? Well, a lot of the system does not have to be transparent. In Georgia, we know what it means not to be transparent. If a system is not transparent, maybe the friends are taken care of first. If the bank is running short of deposits, and you're waiting in line and someone goes in the back door and gets their money, that's not a transparent system. If the pricing is different for you versus you, it's not transparent. Technology. We can have, and this is an excellent book, Michael Lewis's book, The Flash Boys, you can have technology take over a system. In a small country like Georgia, relative to large financial markets, having technology systems that could be accessed by people outside the country would probably be a bad idea, because you could easily lose control. Your markets would be smaller and you could lose control. Globalization. Let's face it, it's an advantage if you can operate with liberal, easy regulations in one place versus another place. So you move capital to where it's easier, more flexible for you, including to not be seen by the markets. I mentioned this before, product complexity. Many times people feel that a basic idea is not seen as a smart idea unless it's made to be more complex. More complex. More complex could be riskier. And riskier is not necessarily helpful to you. So if you're starting new markets here in Georgia, no reason to start with the most complex ideas. Don't have a finance director or who just got out of Harvard Business School and is so intrigued by the latest and the greatest, and he or she wants to move everything here. Let's start simple and understandable. The industries in many, many countries lobby. They try to manipulate government policies to their own advantage. All industries try to do that, except it means that government policies may perform less as a fiduciary and more as a function of special interests, if that happens. People in the industry think that all these characteristics make financial regulation extremely difficult. I don't know. I think it can be made to be difficult if the system runs away from you. Or it's an excuse for allowing some people to do more of what they want versus what you need. You don't have the same level of information, what we call asymmetrical information, from one place to another. That hurts stability. And governments, while they're well-meaning and they want to monitor activity, they often don't pay enough to hire the people with the expertise to do this job. So the same way highway departments sometimes don't use test equipment to measure the strength of their road systems from an engineering point of view, security regulators may not hire people to measure the strength of the financial system to make sure structurally that it's sound. So therefore, the government capacity could be low in the financial sector relative to need. So this is another context issue here in Georgia. If you're going to build up the financial sector here, and apparently the banks are already performing well, they're credible enough in 2 cases to be listed on the London Stock Exchange, you want to find that you can do this where there's a reasonable match of the financial regulatory system to the size and complexity of the financial sector. So therefore, government's capacity to regulate and have policies needs to be reasonably synchronized in terms of quality and size of the capacity of government versus the private sector. Regulatory challenges involved. Industries are often fragmented. So everything I'm saying almost demands coherence, coordination, integration, words like that. But if it's fragmented, that means you can have regulatory arbitrage. You can have risks where the government is there almost encouraging risks and then has to come in with bank bailouts to reward the poorest performers. This, like anything else, undermines the credibility and trust of government. The private sector is there to make the money, and it's regulated, and it's not performing, and it fails. Should it just fail? Especially if your savings are protected in some meaningful percentage. And the investors who own these financial organizations have taken the risk, and if they're wiped out, that's what happens. However, if that severely is going to hurt a country, then it becomes a policy decision. And a policy decision is a political decision. So the intersection here between politics and policy during crises becomes quite close. And that's why politics and the regulatory structure use well-financed functions, especially in the developed world, to influence regulatory outcomes. Because they want to know, thank you very much, we're going to just pass out, distribute the slides. They want to know that when it comes time for a problem, that the government will be there to support them. In Georgia, there's no reason for you to accept that policy without thinking it through thoroughly, because you're just starting. I think in terms of regulatory challenges, the biggest one is human capital. The regulator's job is, again, I'm repeating this, you've got to find the people who understand this and who are willing to work here and do things without any influence or corruption, so that your country's system is protected. So the challenge is complicated because there are different mindsets of stakeholders. Stakeholder analysis in financial sector development is no different than it is in parks or any other area. You have to understand who the players are. Policymakers, regulators, all the different finance firms. This is listed early on in your chart in the beginning, under the sources and users of funds, pardon me, where you have all those private firms. They, by grouping, can be stakeholders. What are the consequences in terms of public welfare regarding what the regulators and policymakers do? Well, they want to strike a balance between competing policy objectives, such as safety and stability. They want to mitigate the consequences to the public of risks, but they do want to ensure effective enforcement and so on, but they want economic growth. Sometimes this list of primary responsibilities aimed to protect the public welfare can create nothing but obstacles. It becomes a barriers and opportunities analysis versus an analysis of what's there to protect the public welfare. What I mean by that is that sometimes the private sector really has to tell the government at a regulatory level, please get out of the way. This is the liberalization of economies that was introduced on Monday. And this involves many areas of regulation. Financial sector is just one. So therefore, you may want to think about the cost of regulation against two things: the total cost, the actual bill for regulation, and then the cost of either liberalizing or constricting financial activity and transaction activities. Private firms focus on shareholder value, profit maximization. There is no debating corporate social responsibility when it comes to these markets. It's about profits. Everything that shareholders want can be summarized as a return on investment. If they put up the $1 million collectively, they would like to get $1,100,000 back, maybe in a certain period of time, like 1 year. That would be a 10% return. Everything you do to lower their return by spending more money, reducing their return, will deprive them of value and profit maximization. So again, the public can be hypocritical regarding this. They want to be protected, but they want returns. So as you're entering your pension and savings program idea here, you want to think about how will I get my money back, but how do I maximize return? If the pension funds that are the result of savings in Georgia are run by policymakers who want assets in the pension funds invested in projects in Georgia for the purpose of attracting capital from outside of Georgia, are those projects good ideas? So if in downtown Tbilisi you decide to put up a soccer stadium just because you have the money, but soccer stadiums may not make any money, would that be a good idea in terms of giving your pension funds as investments a return? All of these things are subject to analysis, absolutely. But many of these decisions can also be subject to political analysis. We want this public project, and the return may be low compared to what you want as savers. So even though you want certain things for the country, you also want returns for your savings. So therefore, there's a direct link between financial sector development and economic development. there's a lot of evidence that economic growth, poverty reduction, inclusion in the financial system, all of these things are benefits of a strong financial sector. And the financial sector can be linked directly. So we have a virtuous circle of capital being raised, money being put to work, job growth happening as a result of that work, and then being returned in the form of more savings, and the cycle begins again. 80 to 90% of gross domestic investment in most developing countries comes from your savings. So this conversation could be held in many, many countries where LAD is teaching, and you have, however, only 40% of the world's population that uses the formal financial sector. So most people in developing countries are outside of this system that I've been describing. You'll make decisions, if you haven't already, as to how much of your net worth do you want in this system versus kept in some other way. Being outside is without bank accounts, access to capital, other benefits from a formal system. You're operating through an informal, money-changing type system. So the effects of a low financial sector participation is you have high inequality. If you don't own financial assets go up in value, you're not getting wealthy. In the United States right now, with the stock market until the beginning of 2016, it's done very well since the financial crisis. Not just a full recovery, but far beyond that. So the beneficiaries of that have been the people with assets. And those are people who have assets in the financial system. If you have not been able to save enough, your assets are not appreciated. So that means low domestic savings available for productive investment creates financial inequality. It's that simple. Increasing participation in the sector, increasing the amount of assets that people have to invest, will reduce that inequality. The primary goal. Right now, this is a big problem in China. It's a very big problem in the United States. It's a big problem in Brazil. We could go on and on. So this is the virtuous circle that we're looking for. We want economic growth. Therefore, we want a capacity of the financial sector to increase so it can function to handle that growth and further support it. And we want additional private sector participation in many forms. The financial sector in my state, in New York State, has grown to be quite large. However, its impact on employment has actually been reduced because the machines, computer systems, can now do a tremendous amount of the work that used to be done by securities professionals. And so we with technology companies. A company like Facebook employs a fraction of the people compared to Ford Motor Company. And the stock market value of Facebook is approximately $28 million in market value per employee of Facebook. Where Ford Motor Company, it's about $250,000. So therefore, the role of technology in Facebook in producing profits is significantly greater than any other company. What that means in practical life is that each of those employees has the chance, if they own stock, to be very wealthy. But total employment contribution by that company, Facebook, to the country is low. In the financial industry, a goal has been to lower employment so that those who work there can make high income and to find ways to substitute for labor. The substitute for labor. So financial sector development does lead to an increase in employment early on because you have government employees, regulators, policymakers, and private sector. But eventually, if the system becomes technology integrated and driven, that employment will peak and start to go down. But the people who work there might be better paid as a result. The key, though, is not the employment objective. Does it get capital to the users of capital? Instead of the financial sector being an objective for economic growth all by itself, Does it get capital to the places where it needs to, like manufacture or agriculture? Or easier to finance education? Governments can interfere in this process. They can limit competition and therefore repress market forces. If the banks are owned by the government and bank lending policies are determined by the government, then we really don't know the system of lending. We don't know where interest rates should be if the central banks are highly regulated and separated from market forces. That's what we have going on in Europe right now and still in the United States. There can be stronger or weaker capital controls. And you can have preferential sectors. So we want to support in Georgia the winemaking industry. Let's put more capital into it. But we already have too much capacity in the wine industry. Why would we want more capital? Let's repurpose some of that land. That's another thing. If some properties are taken off the market because water has to be conserved, we talked about the other day, that's a form of directing investment to other areas. Let's say foreign institutions are better than Georgian institutions. They're in this country already. Do we give them a different status to operate? Because their costs may be lower. All of these are possible obstacles to being virtuous in terms of what I was describing. And this is definitely true in China and many African countries. Roger Leeds has a lot of experience in Africa. I only have a little. But certainly in China, the banks that are state-owned enterprises, SOEs, state-owned enterprises, have a huge advantage. Their return on capital can be lower because the state owns them. And they have development banks. The China Development Bank is the largest in the world, easily $1.3 trillion in assets. It's gigantic. And it can invest in China domestically. So it's a direct competitor to financial institutions. Domestic interest rates may be kept very low in order for money to get into the system, but that hurts savers. This is our problem in the United States right now. Savings returns are very low because of the management of interest rates by the Federal Reserve. It's interesting, all of this work, how about when it comes time for you to have money, get money? How many people have here in this room have tried to get a loan from a bank for a business? Anytime. Not for your house, but for a business. How easy it is it to get a loan for a business? Hard. What's hard about it?
The first thing is that we have a different style in Georgian reality because you have to put under collateral even your own property in order to take the loan for the business.
That's actually normal stuff.
Yeah, but they don't.
Depends on the amount. It's not always the case. Depends on the amount.
Well, she's in tens of millions of dollars for her business investment.
And the thing was that they were not financing the startup businesses.
Okay, so small to medium-sized enterprises often don't have access to the business system, to the banking system. Would that be true here? Yes. Just speak louder, please.
I'm representing big corporations, so for us it was relatively easy to renegotiate the loans from local Georgian banks, we negotiate loans from City Corporation, Citibank, and we negotiate loans from Overseas Private Investment Corporation of the United States.
Why is a
So
large
it was
corporation?
easier.
Why is a large corporation considered a better credit than any of you? I get to know you, I trust you, I know your character, I understand your business idea. Why can't I get a loan? Credibility.
Track record.
Track record, credibility, capacity. What do you mean by capacity?
Provide papers and statements in a manner that is okay for.
So accounting and controls,
Right.
you know what you're doing, right? Where a corporation may have a whole floor of people doing this work, right? Who else was?
They have value, I mean, they have, like, sounds right, I mean, they have assets.
They have assets that could be used by the bank as collateral. And, pardon me? Liquid assets, that's right. So they may have raised money in the debt market and not used that money for spending, but it increases their available capital possibly. So I want to ask my friend here, if I were to negotiate with a bank in Georgia, how would I do this? If I wanted to start a business with 10 people in this room,
Yeah.
what would be my strategy to get a good deal from a bank in Georgia?
First, you would show a good business plan, viable
Good business.
business plan, and you would put up a collateral twice as much as your the loan you want, and then we can start negotiation.
Okay, so I don't know if everybody could hear that, but it starts with the business plan, then you put up collateral, which would be twice the amount of the loan. So the simple common sense question is, if I have enough money for twice the amount of the loan, why do I need to borrow from you? Right? The bank is simply lending using your money. They're going to say, give me all this, let's say you want $100,000, and you have $200,000 of collateral. You put the $200,000 in their bank in account A, we'll call that savings, and in account B, it's a loan, and they hand you $100,000. They hold on, just in case, to your $200,000. But you are establishing credit. The banking system is giving you a chance to perform. See if you meet the loan standards by paying interest on a monthly basis, et cetera. And how's your business plan doing? Let's say your first business plan is a success, then you come back. However, most of the companies that are able to get the loans in developing countries are larger. Therefore, the people who control them have advantages. You can have companies go to equity capital markets and raise money. But there you need a developed market. But you can have private equity markets, such as venture capital, that serves the same function. What you're looking for is a pool of capital that is available to support economic growth. It doesn't have to be through the banks alone, and it doesn't have to be through the equity markets alone. The third obstacle to this virtuous circle is weak governance. And we've talked about this, if professional self-regulation is not yet in existence because there's not enough history, then government has to do it, but government needs the people, it needs protections, it needs a court system or a regulatory system. This takes time to develop. An alternative is to do it on a self-regulatory basis, and this can be very successful. You also have a form of regulation that helps you prevent perversion. If there's good corporate governance, then the money is not misspent on corporate jets or fancy apartments or dinners in Tbilisi or trips to London. So the behavior internally is not just about reputation risk, but about sound financial and risk management. And the financial markets, to the extent that they are transparent and people can get in who should get in, not with criminal records or who have violated things in the past that would be objectionable. Again, these can be good or bad forces. It's a common sense rule. You'll know when it doesn't make sense. I was listening last night to the discussion. I felt that I was on this panel, but I wasn't on the panel. I felt that the panel was so focused on immediate political concerns that long-term economic planning was just not a priority. It was very difficult. And I asked some of the panelists afterwards, and they said, that's the reality here. To do this type of work, financial sector development, you need political will. You need political leaders who have an interest in getting this done. Now, clearly, after the financial crash in 1987, it's worth reading about, a lot of governments in Asia had to get their act together because they couldn't conduct security transactions and foreign exchange at the same time. Countries that adjust their currencies Any country that's trying to interfere with the markets has unfortunately lost credibility. So macroeconomic performance, that's another factor. If your market is competitive, if your currency is stable, you have price stability and fiscal stability. Therefore, trust and credibility of the institutions, what I was mentioning, solid long-term assets, that means that people are more willing to invest. And that can affect the progress of financial sector development. Lots of things that would make sense. Talent and depth of human capital, media that can report what needs to be reported. I was interviewed yesterday. I was very impressed by the reporter, very knowledgeable, very disciplined in her interview. And that you have an enforcement function. There's a big debate in the United States. The entire financial crisis, you didn't have one CEO go to jail for taking down trillions of dollars of losses, bringing down trillions of dollars in losses. Who is impacted by enforcement? So you can have a checklist. In the back of your papers, there's a checklist, and it shows for your country. Doesn't have to show perfectly for Georgia, but let's say that it's reasonable. You have a supply side, domestic savings, and a demand side, an availability of short, medium, long-term debt, equity, and consumer finance products. It's a very simple list. Short, medium, long-term debt and equity, consumer finance products. You have a safe payment system, fiduciary. You have competition, standards of financial reporting, and a credible legal and enforcement environment. This is a very good checklist. And that's the end of the lecture. So what we should do now is have questions, leave the checklist up, and questions that pertain to experience in Georgia. And because we started 5 minutes late, we have 10 minutes for questions. Yes?
I have one comment followed by a question, and I would like to, in the framework of PPP, so please help.
Oh, I'm very comfortable with this.
So, the financial system development is followed in the companies, and as a result, it gives the overall economic performance and the poverty alleviation. It's absolutely true. But if you take the case of Georgia, from early beginning of the first decade of this century, quite recently, the GDP growth was quite from 7% ranging to 12% consecutively. But it was mostly based on the good performance of the financial sector, and this wasn't adequately translated into the welfare of the general population. It was, but not adequate.
So there's evidence of benefits, but not, let's say,
the GDP was growing, but it was marginal transfer.
Okay.
It was a Gini.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
Gini ratio was pretty high.
Okay.
Gini is around 0.4, which is still falls in OECD ranges. It's still okay, around the level of Chile.
Okay. So far, so good.
So I found that I was thinking about this, and it's mentioned that the obstacle to financial virtuous circle is that the banks were averse, they had aversion to lend to small and medium enterprises. That was the bank system, which is like there is no government regulation, no fixed interest rate, no government pushing to do this or that, but they themselves inherently were averse to give it small and medium-sized enterprises. And this was one of the reasons, as I think, that that the GDP growth in figures was not felt by general population. Because SMEs are the drivers and the locomotives of the economy. So, looking now in the retrospect, would there be any space for government to step in or to do something in the framework of PPP?
Yeah. This is a really good observation and question. And it's no surprise that provincial governments or state governments, which are as big as countries in many places, they are asking this question all the time. What should our policy be to encourage citizens to start their own business? I mean, whether it's Sao Paulo or Beijing, it doesn't matter. Both cities are 20 million people, and they both have many, many young people. Young people flock to these cities. It's where the schools are, and they want to start businesses. I know a lot of young people in Beijing who are entrepreneurs. You wouldn't think so, and in fact, it didn't exist. It's a relatively recent phenomenon, certainly less than 10 years old. But people see the chance to come up with an idea and maybe get financing. But the financing is often outside the system. In other words, it's through private investors who want to take a chance on young people. What can government do? It can allocate. There's a fund here in Bulgaria, it was brought up. You can allocate a small percentage, maybe 5% of assets to entrepreneurs and see on a local basis what is going to make sense. I think we tried that in the role playing yesterday with the owner of the hotel and connecting with the school and other participants such as the general contractor. So these are not big jobs. They're local good jobs in terms of ownership. A lot of states and municipalities form economic development corporations. Economic development corporations. And EDC has the focus of combining public and private values to produce economic development. And partners in these deals could be a university plus private sector. The Israeli University Technikon and Cornell University have teamed up with the city of New York to create a huge campus in the East River. And part of the land of the campus has been donated by the city of New York, and it's going to be used for actually housing businesses, large numbers of businesses that are associated with the faculty and students from the school, plus others, to create a knowledge center in a public-private partnership. It's initiated by a fellow I know pretty well, Bob Steele, and it's a $3 billion project. So just having that idea produces a huge amount of economic activity. And we could be thinking about potential partners here and what does the knowledge center look like in Tbilisi, and what could it look like, depending on the expertise. I know you're working very, very hard on your final presentations to come up with ideas that will support this. Other questions? Yes?
From a public policy perspective, how important is the issue of the stock market itself being private or public?
Stock markets can be private. I mean, certainly the New York Stock Exchange had been owned for well over a century by its members. I was a member of the New York Stock Exchange on behalf of Morgan Stanley, what we call an upstairs member, but we bought a seat at the time. It cost $250,000. The seat was in my name, and this was a private ownership. So when the New York Stock Exchange became a public company, the people who owned the membership got a return on their investment. Unfortunately, I had returned my membership to Morgan Stanley at the time, but it can be private or publicly traded, still in the private sector. What matters is its regulation. So it takes on a semi-governmental position, its profile, because the activities are heavily regulated internally, plus by the industry, plus by the federal government. So I don't think the underlying ownership is that important. And I'm very comfortable with private ownership of these markets. Pardon me?
Whether it's government owned or private?
I'm more comfortable with private ownership. Yes.
I have a question about central bank.
Yes.
As I understand, it is very important for central bank to be independent and to provide stability and credibility of national currency. In Ukraine, some experts say that in fact our central bank finance the state budget deficit, and that's why our central bank isn't enough independent. And they say we have very weak currency, no credibility, and so on. So let use foreign currency. We don't need Ukrainian hryvnia, and we don't need central bank at all. What is your point of view concerning such recommendation? Do you think it will help to the economic development and to credibility to the financial market?
I think, it's a long time since I've heard a question like that. And what's interesting is that maybe we should not take for granted the value of central banks. Maybe they're not always performing. The European Central Bank, let's move away from Georgia for a minute in terms of its relatively small size in terms of the economy, and look at the European Central Bank or the American Federal Reserve Bank. These are large, influential institutions, and they have tremendous control over economic flows because they determine the price of money. Irrespective of whether Georgia has a central bank or not, irrespective of what your alternative is, the cost of money is going to be influenced by the cost of money in other places. So you do need institutions, one way or the other, that are going to be in a position to regulate your capital flows and do it in a way that is credible. So I don't have a particular opinion in terms of the Georgia Central Bank. My response would be, that's a good idea, assuming that it's compatible with many other forms of criteria. But I'm sorry, in Ukraine. Thank you. I don't have a particular opinion, but I do know that there's been a perversion of the role of these institutions in other places. Yes?
Yes, Alan. In 2008, we had an international financial crisis, especially at Wall Street, and after it, we didn't see even one CEO or one financial responsible in jail or made accountable. So while the whole financial system of the world crashed, and part of it was the way that Wall Street used to deal and work with or control the financial system. Now we are, all the predictions are saying that in 2016 we might face the same crisis. And huge, big institutions disappeared in 2008, and it impacted the whole system because they are all connected all over the world. One more time, is it a double standard issue?
Well, I'm going to briefly answer the question because our time is out. A lot of rules have changed. So the components of the financial system have been forced by regulators to hold more capital so that their balance sheets are not as regulated. There is substantially greater regulation. The regulatory costs for a large global bank like JP Morgan have increased by the billions to make sure that everything is being watched. Morgan Stanley, my old firm, is unrecognizable. The compliance people really rule all decisions. So that there's far less risk from those institutions than there was in 2007. But there are still many institutions operating in the system, hedge funds and other private equity, that control trillions of dollars of capital that are not regulated. And there are markets for securities and derivatives of securities, futures and options in both equities and fixed income, that are incomprehensible to most regulators. So there are a lot of pieces of the system that are still outside the system and not necessarily transparent. So that means that the risks are still there. They've shifted. They've shifted purposely in design so that there can be opportunities for flexibility. But we always look at regulation through a rear view mirror. We try to find out, as we're driving by, we see the accident that happened, and we try to fix what we can see based on our experience. But we're not always able to predict the future through regulation, typically not. All right, thank you very much. Our time is up.